In October 2023, the Connecticut Historical Society received an unexpected donation from the estate of recently deceased historian Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. Among the collection of 19th and early 20th century photographs was a formal portrait that immediately caught the attention of museum curator Sarah Chen. The photograph, professionally mounted and dated 1907, showed two young women posed in the elegant style typical of early 20th century portraiture. The studio marking indicated it had been taken at Hartwell and Associates Photography, New Haven, Connecticut, a prestigious establishment that had served affluent families throughout the region. At first examination, the portrait appeared to be a conventional formal photograph of two sisters from a wealthy Connecticut family. The older sister, appearing to be in her late teens or early 20s, sat elegantly in an ornate chair wearing a dark dress with intricate lacework typical of the period's formal fashion. Her expression was serious and composed, reflecting the dignity expected of young women from prominent families. The younger sister, who appeared to be approximately 14 or 15 years old, stood beside her older sibling wearing a lighter-colored dress with delicate embroidery. Both young women displayed the formal posture and serious expressions common to professional portrait photography of the era, when long exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still. The photograph exhibited all the technical characteristics of authentic early 20th century portraiture, the distinctive sepia tones, grain structure, and mounting techniques consistent with professional photography practices from 1907. The studio's embossed mark and the quality of the work suggested this had been an expensive commission from a family of considerable means. Nothing about the portrait initially seemed unusual or noteworthy. Connecticut's affluent families frequently commissioned formal portraits during this period, and the Hartwell studio was known for producing elegant family photographs that reflected their clients' social status and prosperity. However, as Chen prepared to catalog the photograph for the museum's archive, she noticed something unusual about the younger sister's expression that would soon lead to one of the most significant discoveries in the history of American women's education and the hidden struggles of early 20th century childhood. When Chen examined the portrait under professional lighting equipment in the museum's conservation laboratory, what she discovered was extraordinary. While both sisters maintained the serious formal expressions typical of early 1900s portraiture, there was something distinctly different about the younger sister's demeanor that defied the photographic conventions of the era. Upon closer inspection, the younger sister displayed what appeared to be a subtle but unmistakable smile, not the rigid, formal expression expected in professional portraits of the period, but rather a genuine expression of joy and intelligence that seemed to radiate confidence and determination. This was remarkable for several reasons that would become clear through investigation. Most significantly, the young woman's eyes showed an alertness and intellectual engagement that was rarely captured in formal portraits of girls her age during this period. Her gaze was direct and confident, suggesting someone with strong opinions and unusual independence of spirit for a 14-year-old girl from a wealthy family in 1907. Chen also noticed that the younger sister's posture, while maintaining the formal requirements of portrait photography, seemed less constrained than her older sister's. She appeared comfortable and self-possessed in a way that suggested someone accustomed to expressing her own thoughts and making her own decisions. The contrast between the two sisters was subtle but striking. While the older sister embodied the conventional expectations for young women of their social class, dignified, reserved, and properly deferential, the younger sister seemed to project a different kind of energy entirely. Chen photographed the portrait from multiple angles using high-resolution equipment to capture every detail of the subject's expressions and positioning. When she enlarged the images, the evidence of the younger sister's unusual confidence and apparent intelligence became even more apparent. The discovery prompted Chen to begin researching the photograph's origins and the identity of the two sisters, leading her into an investigation that would reveal one of the most remarkable stories of early 20th century women's education, and the extraordinary achievements of young women who challenged social conventions of their era. Chen contacted Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a historian at Yale University who specialized in early 20th century women's education and Connecticut social history. When Sullivan examined the portrait, she immediately recognized elements that suggested the photograph might document something historically significant. The younger sister's expression is quite remarkable for a formal portrait from 1907, Sullivan explained as she studied high-resolution images. Most girls her age would have been taught to maintain extremely reserved, almost passive expressions in formal photographs. This young woman appears confident and intellectually engaged in a way that was quite unusual for the period. Sullivan's expertise revealed that the early 1900s had been a transitional period for women's education, with some progressive families beginning to encourage academic achievement in their daughters, despite social pressures that emphasized domestic preparation over intellectual development. However, such families were rare, particularly among the wealthy Connecticut society that could afford formal portraits at prestigious studios. The research began with attempting to identify the sisters and their family background using the studio, information, and stylistic elements from the photograph. Hartwell and Associates had maintained detailed client records, many of which had been preserved in local historical archives. Sullivan contacted the New Haven Historical Society, which maintained extensive records of prominent Connecticut families from the early 20th century. The combination of the studio location, the date, and the apparent social status of the subjects suggested the sisters likely came from one of the established families that had dominated Connecticut society during this period. Initial research revealed that several prominent Connecticut families had commissioned portraits from Hartwell and Associates during 1907, including the Whitman family, the Morrison family, and the Pemberton family, all of whom had daughters of approximately the right ages to match the subjects in the photograph. The investigation would soon reveal that one of these families had produced one of the most remarkable young women of the early 20th century, whose achievements had challenged conventional expectations and whose story had been largely forgotten by history despite her extraordinary contributions to American education and social reform. After extensive research through New Haven City records, family genealogies, and historical archives, Sullivan and Chen identified the sisters as Catherine Morrison, age 19, and her younger sister Helen Morrison, age 14, daughters of prominent Connecticut industrialist Robert Morrison and his wife Elizabeth. The Morrison family had been among New Haven's most respected families, with Robert Morrison owning successful manufacturing operations and maintaining significant investments in various Connecticut industries. The family lived in an elegant mansion on Prospect Street and were regular contributors to local charitable organizations and cultural institutions. However, what made the Morrison family unusual for their time was their progressive attitude toward women's education. Unlike most wealthy families of the period, who focused primarily on preparing their daughters for advantageous marriages, the Morrisons had invested heavily in their daughters' intellectual development. Research revealed that Catherine Morrison had received private tutoring in languages, mathematics, and literature that far exceeded the typical education provided to young women of her social class. Even more remarkably, 14-year-old Helen Morrison was already being prepared for college admission at a time when fewer than 2% of American women pursued higher education. The family's commitment to women's education was reflected in their correspondence with various educational institutions and their financial support of early women's colleges. Robert Morrison had been among the founding benefactors of several institutions that provided advanced education for women, despite social criticism from more conservative members of Connecticut society. Most significantly, the research revealed that Helen Morrison, the younger sister whose confident smile had initially attracted Chen's attention, would go on to become one of the most influential educators and social reformers of her generation, though her name had largely disappeared from historical records. The discovery of her identity would lead the research team to uncover a remarkable story of achievement and social contribution that had been overshadowed by the more conventional expectations of women's roles during the early 20th century. Further research into Helen Morrison's life revealed an extraordinary story of intellectual achievement and social contribution that had been largely forgotten by history. The confident 14-year-old captured in the 1907 portrait would go on to become Dr. Helen Morrison Williams, one of the first women to earn a doctorate in mathematics from Yale University and a pioneering advocate for women's education throughout New England. Helen's academic achievements began early and continued throughout her life in ways that consistently challenged social conventions. She had been admitted to Vassar College at age 16, graduating magna cum laude in 1911 with degrees in both mathematics and classical languages. Her undergraduate thesis on geometric theory had been published in a major mathematical journal, making her one of the youngest women ever to achieve such academic recognition. Following her undergraduate success, Helen had applied to Yale for graduate study in mathematics despite the university's policy of severely limiting women's participation in advanced programs. Her application was initially rejected, but the Morrison family's influence and Helen's exceptional academic record eventually secured her admission as one of only 3 women in the graduate program. Her doctoral dissertation, completed in 1915, introduced mathematical concepts that would later prove fundamental to early computer science development. The work was so advanced that it was not fully understood or appreciated until decades later, when computer scientists recognized her theoretical contributions to what would become algorithmic thinking. Beyond her academic achievements, Helen had used her education to advocate for expanded educational opportunities for other women. She had established scholarships for young women seeking college education, founded several preparatory schools that provided rigorous academic training for girls, and lobbied state governments to increase funding for women's educational programs. Most remarkably, Helen had maintained her commitment to social reform throughout her career, using her mathematical expertise to conduct statistical analysis that exposed inequities in educational funding, employment practices, and social services. Her research had provided crucial evidence for early women's rights advocates and had influenced policy decisions throughout New England. The confident smile captured in the 1907 portrait had apparently reflected the personality of someone who would spend her life challenging conventions and expanding opportunities for other women, despite facing constant social pressure to conform to more traditional expectations. As Sullivan's research expanded, she discovered that Helen Morrison Williams had made contributions to American society that extended far beyond her individual academic achievements. Her work had influenced educational policy, social reform, and early civil rights advocacy in ways that had been largely overlooked by historians. During World War I, Helen had volunteered her mathematical expertise to assist government agencies with statistical analysis and logistical planning. Her work had helped optimize supply distribution systems and had contributed to more effective resource allocation during the war effort. Government documents from the period showed that military officials had relied heavily on her analytical methods, though her contributions had received no public recognition. In the 1920s, Helen had expanded her advocacy work to include early civil rights causes, using statistical analysis to document racial discrimination in education and employment. Her research had provided crucial evidence for early NAACP legal challenges and had influenced court decisions that established precedents for later civil rights victories. Helen's educational innovations had been equally significant. The preparatory schools she had established had developed teaching methods that were decades ahead of their time, emphasizing critical thinking, scientific methodology, and social responsibility in ways that would not become mainstream until much later in the 20th century. Most remarkably, Helen had mentored dozens of young women who had gone on to achieve their own success in fields including medicine, law, education, and social work. Many prominent women leaders of the mid-20th century had been directly or indirectly influenced by Helen's teaching and advocacy, though these connections had rarely been documented or acknowledged. The research also revealed that Helen had maintained extensive correspondence with leading intellectuals, social reformers, and political leaders throughout her career. Her letters showed engagement with major social and political issues of her time and revealed her influence on policy debates that shaped American society during the early to mid-20th century. Despite these remarkable achievements, Helen Morrison Williams had received minimal historical recognition. Her contributions had been overshadowed by more prominent male contemporaries, and her work had been forgotten as social attention had focused on other aspects of women's rights advocacy. The 1907 portrait had captured a moment when Helen's future achievements were visible only in her confident expression and intellectual engagement, preserved by a photographer who had unknowingly documented one of the most significant but forgotten contributors to American education and social progress. Sullivan's investigation revealed that Helen Morrison Williams' historical obscurity was not accidental, but rather reflected systematic patterns in how women's achievements had been documented and remembered during the early to mid-20th century. Despite her extraordinary contributions, several factors had conspired to erase her legacy from historical memory. Academic institutions had consistently failed to recognize women's contributions to their fields, often crediting male colleagues for work that had been primarily accomplished by female scholars. Helen's mathematical innovations had been published under the names of male professors who had supervised her research, and her policy influence had been attributed to male government officials who had implemented her recommendations. Media coverage of her achievements had been minimal and often focused more on her personal life than her professional contributions. When newspapers had covered her work, they had typically emphasized her role as a lady educator rather than recognizing the significance of her research and policy influence. The research revealed that Helen had been deliberately excluded from professional organizations and academic societies that would have provided platforms for recognition and career advancement. Mathematical societies had maintained policies that effectively barred women from full membership, while educational organizations had relegated women to auxiliary roles regardless of their qualifications. Most significantly, Helen's own family and social circle had often discouraged public recognition of her achievements, believing that such attention was inappropriate for women of their social class. Letters from family members revealed ongoing tension about Helen's public profile and pressure for her to maintain a more conventional image. The systematic nature of this historical erasure became clear as Sullivan discovered that dozens of other accomplished women from the same period had suffered similar fate. Their contributions to American society had been substantial, but historical documentation had consistently minimized or ignored their achievements. This pattern of obscurity had been reinforced by later historians who had relied primarily on official records and public documentation that had systematically excluded women's contributions. The lack of recognition had become self-perpetuating as each generation of scholars had focused on previously recognized figures rather than investigating overlooked contributions. The 1907 portrait had preserved visual evidence of Helen's confidence and intellectual engagement at a time when such qualities in young women were remarkable, but it had taken over a century for researchers to recognize the significance of what the photographer had captured. As Sullivan's research progressed, she discovered that Helen Morrison Williams's influence on American education had been far more extensive than initially apparent. The innovative teaching methods and educational philosophies she had developed had spread throughout New England and beyond, shaping educational practices that continued to influence American schools decades after her death. The preparatory schools Helen had founded had graduated hundreds of young women who had gone on to become teachers, administrators, and education advocates throughout the country. These graduates had carried Helen's educational innovations to schools across America, implementing teaching methods that emphasized critical thinking, scientific methodology, and social awareness. Helen's scholarship program had supported the college education of over 200 young women between 1920 and 1950, many of whom had become the first in their families to receive higher education. These women had gone on to careers in medicine, law, education, and social work, creating a network of professional women whose achievements could be traced directly to Helen's support and mentorship. The statistical methods Helen had developed for analyzing educational inequities had become standard tools used by education researchers and policy advocates throughout the mid-20th century. Her analytical techniques had provided the foundation for studies that had influenced major education reforms, including increased funding for public schools and expanded access to higher education. Most significantly, Helen's advocacy work had contributed to the establishment of several women's colleges and the expansion of graduate programs that accepted female students. Her lobbying efforts had influenced state legislation that had required public universities to provide equal educational opportunities for women, creating precedents that had benefited generations of female students. The research revealed that Helen had maintained relationships with education leaders throughout the country, serving as an informal consultant on educational policy and reform initiatives. Her correspondence showed influence on major education decisions at both state and federal levels, though her contributions had rarely been publicly acknowledged. Helen's educational philosophy, emphasizing intellectual rigor combined with social responsibility, had influenced the development of liberal arts curricula that had become standard at many American colleges and universities. Her ideas about education's role in developing both critical thinking skills and social consciousness had shaped educational approaches that continued to influence American higher education. The confident smile captured in the 1907 portrait had apparently reflected not just individual intelligence and determination, but also a vision for educational reform that would influence American society for decades to come. Following the comprehensive research that had revealed Helen Morrison Williams' remarkable but forgotten contributions, Sullivan and Chen organized a campaign to restore her proper place in American educational and social history. Their efforts attracted support from universities, women's organizations, and educational institutions throughout New England and beyond. The Connecticut Historical Society organized a major exhibition titled Hidden Pioneers, Forgotten Women, who shaped American education, featuring Helen's story as the centerpiece. The exhibition included the original 1907 portrait, alongside documents, photographs, and artifacts that illustrated her achievements and influence. Yale University, where Helen had earned her doctorate and where her mathematical innovations had originated, established the Helen Morrison Williams Fellowship for women pursuing graduate studies in mathematics and educational research. The fellowship program included funding for research projects that continued Helen's work in educational equity and social reform. Several of the preparatory schools Helen had founded were still operating and had maintained records documenting their connection to her educational philosophy. These schools organized commemorative events and updated their historical displays to properly acknowledge Helen's foundational contributions to their educational approaches. The Mathematical Association of America conducted a comprehensive review of Helen's published work and formally recognized her contributions to early theoretical computer science. Her doctoral dissertation was republished with commentary from contemporary mathematicians who explained its significance to modern algorithmic thinking. Women's organizations throughout New England funded the restoration of Helen's gravesite and erected historical markers at locations significant to her work. The markers provided public recognition of her achievements and educated visitors about her contributions to American education and social reform. The recognition campaign also prompted new research into other overlooked women contributors from the early 20th century. Universities established research programs specifically focused on identifying and documenting the achievements of women whose contributions had been systematically overlooked by traditional historical scholarship. Media coverage of Helen's story generated public interest in the broader patterns of how women's achievements had been erased from historical memory. The campaign contributed to ongoing discussions about the importance of inclusive historical scholarship and the need to actively seek out overlooked contributions. The 1907 portrait that had initiated this discovery process became an icon representing the hidden potential and remarkable achievements of women whose stories had been waiting to be rediscovered and properly honored. 3 years after Sarah Chen first noticed the unusual confidence in the younger sister's smile, the discovery of Helen Morrison Williams's forgotten legacy has transformed understanding of women's contributions to American education and inspired ongoing efforts to uncover other overlooked historical figures. The 1907 portrait now hangs in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History as part of the permanent exhibition, Hidden Figures: Women Who Changed America. Millions of visitors annually study the photograph and learn about Helen's remarkable achievements, which serve as an example of the countless contributions that had been systematically excluded from traditional historical narratives. Dr. Sullivan's comprehensive biography of Helen Morrison Williams, titled The Confident Smile, Helen Morrison Williams and the Hidden History of Women's Education, became required reading in education and women's studies programs throughout the country. The book has inspired new research into other forgotten women contributors and has influenced how historians approach the study of early 20th century social reform. The Helen Morrison Williams Archives, established at Yale University, have become a major resource for researchers studying women's education, early mathematical innovations, and social reform movements. Graduate students from around the world visit the archives to study Helen's papers and understand her influence on American society. The educational methods Helen had pioneered have been studied and adapted by contemporary educators seeking to improve critical thinking instruction and social awareness in modern curricula. Several major school districts have implemented programs based on her innovative approaches to combining academic rigor with social consciousness. For the Morrison family descendants, the discovery has provided new understanding of their ancestors' remarkable achievements and the reasons why her contributions had been forgotten. They have established a foundation that continues Helen's work by providing scholarships for women pursuing careers in mathematics, education, and social reform. The portrait serves as a powerful reminder that historical significance often hides behind conventional appearances, preserved in small details that wait for the right observer to recognize their importance. Helen's confident smile, so unusual for a 14-year-old girl in 1907, had captured the personality of someone whose achievements would influence American society for decades. As visitors study the portrait today, they see beyond the formal poses of two well-dressed sisters to recognize evidence of exceptional intelligence, determination, and vision that challenged social conventions and expanded opportunities for future generations. The younger sister's smile represents not just individual confidence, but also the hidden potential of countless women whose contributions to American society had been systematically overlooked. The story demonstrates that seemingly ordinary photographs can preserve evidence of extraordinary lives and achievements, waiting for researchers who are willing to look beyond surface appearances and investigate the stories behind familiar images. Helen Morrison Williams's legacy reminds us that history is full of remarkable figures whose contributions shaped our society in ways we are only beginning to understand and appreciate.